Hello and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Robin Butler. I am an assistant track and field coach at Southern Utah University and a grad student in Southern Utah University's Sports Conditioning and Performance program. Today, we are going to be talking about disordered eating in high-level athletes. Disordered eating is extremely prevalent in athletics today. Whether it involves common eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa, many athletes have ended their careers due to these conditions, or in the least, severely limited their performance. Disordered eating looks different for every athlete. It can come from a lack of control over environment, social pressure, pressure from coaching staff or athletic training staff, lack of control, poor body image, or others. Athletes rarely self-report disordered eating due to many factors, some of which can be mitigated by athletic training and coaching staff, as I mentioned previously. Due to the close relationship between athletic training, coaching staff, and their athletes, there is a significant opportunity for people in those positions to help mitigate the problem that is eating disorders in athletes today and support athletes that are experiencing disordered eating themselves or are recovering from disordered eating. Disordered eating in high-level athletics is a thoroughly documented issue by researchers and athletes themselves, as you found out in our supplementary material. Athlete testaments will tell you that the high-pressure nature of competing at such a consistently and high level can lead to excess stress, which has been linked to disordered eating. In addition, there is a close relationship tied between weight, body fat percentage, and performance. Research shows that disordered eating is extremely prevalent in athletes and is among the most dangerous of all mental health conditions. I will discuss identification, treatment, and prevention of disordered eating in athletes. I will further discuss the best practices for athletic training and coaching staff on managing DE in athletes. The learning objectives that I have for you all today are to identify several psychological, physical, and social behavioral signs and symptoms of disordered eating, identify at least one aspect of competition that influences an athlete to begin disordered eating, and explain at least one concept that can be taught to athletic training or coaching staff in order to help prevent disordered eating in a team environment. The structure of today's presentation will look as follows. We will cover what is disordered eating, including the definitions, prevalence in athletics, and common information, identification of disordered eating in athletes, physical, psychological, and social signs and symptoms, treatment methods and efficacy from the perspective of athletic training and coaching staff, prevention of disordered eating, and application of research. To wrap it all up, we will have a few discussion questions. So why are we talking about disordered eating today? Part of this is my years spent as an athlete. While I was an athlete at Western State Colorado University, I developed minor disordered eating as an athlete and was fortunately able to self-treat. My sister struggled with and successfully hid bulimia and anorexia from me for years before getting help and telling me the truth. Brooks Beast, Ali Ostrander, who you'll see in your supplementary materials, who I've been following closely since well before she came out that she had an eating disorder, exercise dependency and its relationship with DE, which is close to me as someone who loves ultra running and long distance running in general. And finally, toxic body image, which is something that I have seen many athletes, many people close to me, my friends and family struggle with. So my time as an athlete, this looked like barely eating during the day. I would wake up in the morning, walk across campus without having anything to eat, stop at the coffee shop on campus to grab a coffee and maybe a muffin if I had time or money for it at the time, as I often struggled affording food while I was in college, go to class, finish my classes, run home before practice, get changed for a 2 o'clock practice, perform my workout to the best of my ability after typically eating extremely little, go home, ate whatever I could, whatever I had at home that was easy and convenient, I would relax as much as I could before I went to weights. And then I distinctly remember many times coming on from weights being absolutely famished, having had very, very little to eat that day, confused as to why I was feeling the way that I did, eating as much as possible. In fact, one of my favorite go-to meals, believe it or not, was instant mashed potatoes mixed with mac and cheese with whatever protein source I had at the time. And this led to a lot of the symptoms that I will discuss later. So this made up for very poor life balance between my athletics, school, and what I was doing at home. I was not taking care of my body the way that I thought that I was. My teammates, some of whom I lived with, were not aware of my eating habits. And generally, my coaches weren't aware. It did not come through in my workouts. I was consistently still able to perform, thankfully. I was not rapidly losing weight, as somehow I was still finding a way to get enough calories. But the wild influx in my food intake throughout the day played a significant toll. And it got so bad as to I thought several times I was going to need to go to the hospital for abdominal pain. And like I said, I was able to self-treat. Thankfully, I have a supportive family. And so once I started sharing the struggles I was having physically, they were able to point out that I was not taking care of myself well and something needed to change. My sister is a much different case where I was in the disordered eating category, but not quite eating disorder category. She developed an eating disorder from a very young age. She took careful documentation while she was in high school and her experience with anorexia, clearly and specifically detailing what she ate for weeks at a time, including generally water, gum, as coping mechanisms to get through the hunger pains. And through that process, she became extremely comfortable, and even I think she would call hunger a friend at the time. It was a comforting feeling for her to have control over her body. This developed into bulimia nervosa. She started to compulsively purge after every meal. Anytime that she had a bathroom, she would take advantage of that to purge. She only ate, so we shared 1 year at Western Colorado. We shared 1 year at university together. And in that year, she was actively in the middle of one of her worst years with bulimia, but she was only eating and only not purging while I was around. So I had nothing to suspect. The fall after I left university, she was purging so much and had done so much damage to her immune system and her throat that she gave herself strep so many times in a 6-month period that she could feel each individual strain's differences and tell them apart before she went to the doctor. And she was confirmed every single time because of her comfort with literally making herself ill. It took her a long time to recover from that. She still experiences nausea in the morning, every morning. She still experiences severe irregularity and abdominal pain to the point where she has difficulty working consistently and not feeling in pain on a regular basis. This is more than 2 years after she started eating disorder recovery. Ali Ostrander is a huge inspiration to me, as I mentioned. She joined Brooks Beast as her first professional running team. Brooks Beast has a personal connection with me because it was one of my favorite teams throughout college. I highly aspired to run professionally after I graduated, and Brooks Beast would have been my dream job. And so I've closely followed the team ever since then. And when I saw that Ali Ostrander, who was a high school phenom, fell off for a time and came back, I was extremely proud of her for being able to make it on that team and to be performing at the ability that she is able to perform, running in Diamond League meets, which if you don't know track and field, those are the premier meets, professional meets in track and field internationally. So she joined Brooks Beast, and about 6 months ago, she posted a video to her YouTube channel, which is the video that I included, talking about her struggle with her eating disorder over the last years. She didn't go into too many specifics, but what it came down to was that her coaches and her friends and her family, and it went so far as Brooks headquarters, all basically telling her that she needed to seek help or she would not be able to run anymore. Here she is 2 years ago, successfully competing for Brooks Beast while still managing behind the scenes her own struggle with eating disorders. Part of Ali Ostrander's story is the close relationship between exercise dependency and the nature of long or longer distance running. And as a long distance runner, Ali Ostrander unfortunately falls into this category and this cruel relationship between exercise dependence and disordered eating. So what is disordered eating? Now we're going to talk about variations and definitions. Disordered eating can come in a wide variety of different forms and severities. As I mentioned, I fell into the very much disordered eating category, whereas my sister and Ali Ostrander fell into the clear eating disorder category. Now, the difference is that eating disorders are definable as the most common bulimia nervosa, anorexia nervosa, or binge eating disorder. Those are the most common eating disorders today in the United States. It's estimated that 1.6 million people in the US are diagnosed with an eating disorder. And that's not disordered eating, that is a strict eating disorder. Eating disorders have a high morbidity rate and among the highest mortality, making them definitively the most severe mental illness today in the United States. Aspects that increase the likelihood of these disorders developing are poor body image, complete lack of intuitive eating. Aspects that increase the likelihood of these disorders developing are poor body image, which is very typical with bulimia and anorexia, complete lack of intuitive eating, which is more common with binge eating disorder and anorexia, body dysmorphia, common with anorexia and bulimia. Coaching recommendations can cover all three, and this does happen. In fact, as of October 2021, this year, the University of Oregon has come under fire for allegations that coaching and athletic training staff were requiring athletes to be under a certain body fat percentage. One athlete specified under 12% body fat percentage as a female athlete in order to compete and travel with the gymnastics team. Allegations have come out from primarily the gymnastics team and the track and field team. However, investigations are still ongoing and are not conclusive, but this does still happen today. Coaching recommendations make a huge impact on athletes and can severely impact the likelihood of bulimia and anorexia, as we'll get into later. Competition pressure, as there is a close tie between an ideal weight or ideal body fat percentage and performance, indicating that the lighter you are, the more likely you are to perform at a high level. High caloric expenditure is really common with binge eating disorder, as you need to consume a lot of calories, especially as a long distance athlete. And this is where ultra marathoners can fall into this category and closely tie exercise dependency or exercise addiction and binge eating disorder because of the sheer number of calories that you need to consume. Myself, for example, when I was competing when I was doing the most mileage during my season as a 6'6", 190-pound male athlete, my BMR is right around 2000. And My caloric expenditure throughout the day was closer to 4,000, which requires a lot of eating, which is where binge eating disorder can start to develop. Fear of social implications or poor body image are really common with bulimia and anorexia, especially anorexia. And then lack of control in or out of athletics is super common with bulimia. Bulimia is generally about control. As I found out through my sister, she was not able to control many parts of her life and therefore went to bulimia, where she knew that she can control when she was purging, when she was absorbing the food that she was eating, and when she was hiding all of this from her friends, family, coworkers, classmates, etc. So next we'll move on to identification, and we'll talk about the physical, psychological, and social signs and symptoms that these eating disorders and disordered eating can come with. Physical symptoms of eating disorders vary widely, and the severity of them vary just as much. So before you is a list of the most common physical signs and symptoms, and I will narrow those down even further. Low female sex hormones and decreased testosterone in men can contribute to the younger look or undeveloped look of athletes that have experienced anorexia for an extended period of time throughout their youth. This is also caused by delayed onset puberty. Extremely common in female athletes that don't have eating disorders are bone mineral density loss, especially in endurance athletes. But when you introduce eating disorders to the mix, menstrual dysfunction and amenorrhea are really common, as well as the mentioned bone mineral density loss, which will show up as a coach. It will show up as prone to stress fractures. I've had many teammates that have struggled with stress fractures over the years, and it's not unlikely that some of those were caused by disordered eating in addition with excessive training volume. Abdominal pain, as I mentioned, abdominal pain is a symptom that can exist long after you've recovered from eating disorder. Athletes' anemia is also extremely common in elite athletes of any variety, especially endurance athletes, and exacerbated by disordered eating. Really apparent physical symptoms are hair loss, dry skin, dry nails or breaking nails, acid damage on hands. That one is especially common with bulimia, as you're constantly sticking your fingers down your throat to purge. Dental decay as a result of high exposure with stomach acid, as well as swollen tonsils for the same thing, and throat pain. As I mentioned, my sister experienced strep throat many times in a short period due to her experiences with bulimia. Frequent weight fluctuation is extremely common when you are back and forth in and out of control with your body and your caloric intake or your nutritional intake. Extreme and unpredictable fatigue can be extremely common as a coach during a workout if an athlete cannot finish a workout and there's no explainable reason. Typically not eating enough food or not getting enough nutrients in general over a period of time can cause that. An excessive muscle weakness in the same category. Psychological and social symptoms include heavily controlled dieting and self-criticism concerning body weight or size. This comes across in social situations, very common. It can look like constantly obsessing over weight, insisting that they are fat, despite that not being the case. Resistance to take any criticism on their size or weight. Ali Ostrander, for example, made it clear in her video that she did not intend to seek recovery, but she was kind of forced into it. And she recognizes that that was a positive decision. But at the time that she made the decision, she felt that it was not her own and that it was not something that she would have made on her own. Excessive exercising, change in social type, introvert to extrovert, that can show a lack of control in personal life. Social withdrawal can be very apparent in team settings. new depression or anxiety symptoms. As we'll discuss later, depression and anxiety can be closely linked with eating disorders. Insomnia can be a significant issue. Disappearing after eating or excessive use of the restroom. This is really common with bulimia, as people suffering from bulimia feel the compulsion to purge, and that looks like disappearing after eating and using the restroom whenever possible, as I explained that my sister had done. Disappearing after eating or excessive use of the restroom is extremely common with bulimia for the reasons that I've already mentioned. And excessive caffeine consumption, as caffeine is a diet suppressant. Caffeine consumption in excess can be extremely common in anorexia, as it suppresses the urge to eat and takes away hunger feelings throughout the day. Screening methods can look like a lot of different things, but the most common screening methods and the most effective screening methods are questionnaires, either mandatory or voluntary. This can be done by athletic training or coaching staff. I have heard of universities using mandatory questionnaires to identify eating disorder risk in their athletes before they develop at the beginning of the season. And it's important that these are mandatory for athletes so that there's no discrimination at hand, and an athlete can't claim discrimination based on certain physical attributes that the athlete might have or any other performance indicators, etc. Making it mandatory can absolutely make these questionnaires bias free, which is really helpful in a coaching and athletic training setting. Healthcare follow-ups are recommended by medical staff exclusively. Coaches or non-medical personnel should not be doing medical follow-ups. It should exclusively be medical staff. And this can come at the recommendation of a coach, but it cannot be done by a coach unless they are a medical professional. Interviews can be conducted at the beginning of each season with specific questioning akin to the questionnaires that I mentioned earlier, that are more vague and more conversational, these meetings or interviews, so as to establish the well-being of each athlete rather than specifically try to identify eating disorder risk in those athletes, although that is a common application of interviews such as this. But any type of interview to identify how an athlete is doing coming into their season, what condition they're in, whether they've been eating well, whether they've been training and working out before, can help coaches figure out whether their athletes are healthy and safe to compete or safe to begin practice at the beginning of a season. And then another really common practice are mandatory DEXA scans, which is the diagram that I have here in front of you is what a DEXA scan looks like. We do these, a similar version here at SUU for our athletes, which include a full sport-specific breakdown of their body composition, and it can identify body fat percentages and body mass in each leg, each arm, segments such as that. And with a sport-specific breakdown and the aid of coaching staff, this can be used to help athletes be healthier and help them be more sustainable. So if their body fat percentage is too low already, they can be encouraged to change their diet up a little bit so that they are in a safer range. So some risks and limitations of these are, as I mentioned with the questionnaires, you're at a risk for athletes claiming discrimination or being extremely defensive. Individuals with eating disorders, especially athletes, as they are extremely rarely self-identified or self-reported. Some risks are pushback. You can absolutely lose an athlete from the team because they don't want to deal with their eating disorder, especially if they feel like they are being approached in an inappropriate way. So those are some risks. And DEXA scans, while they are extremely beneficial in a medical and sports-specific setting, when those numbers are taken out of context or taken away from the specific sport that they are relevant to, they can be more detrimental than helpful. An athlete can start to focus too much on their weight or their body fat percentage, and that can foster obsessive behavior. And that requires very careful and intentional communication from coaching or whichever university professional is operating the DEXA and explaining the breakdown of their stats. So now we're going to take a look at a research article that tried to identify the strategies used by coaches to identify disordered eating in track and field athletes. It includes 11 track and field coaches from all over the country and thematic analysis done on verbatim manuscripts from each interview. So it was found that through these interviews that coaches use physical, social, and performance indicators to identify potential disordered eating in their athletes. Some of these we've already talked about. The physical signs and symptoms can be obvious in certain cases, especially severe cases. And so as such, it's important that coaches do monitor their athletes in this way. And in this study, it was found that coaches were monitoring their athletes' eating habits and behaviors as much as they could. Coaches specifically noted weight gain or weight loss as a key indicator. Also, unfortunately, due to the interview nature of this and the limited nature that these coaches had with their athletes, athlete secrecy and or masking behaviors, as well as the differences in communication between coaches and their athletes, and or coaches that don't get along with all of their athletes, that really limited the finding and the accuracy of some of these interviews. And it was found that coaches still employed stereotypes that complicated the identification process. This included some things that I talked about earlier with the University of Oregon requiring their athletes to be below a certain body fat percentage or a certain weight or BMI in order to compete. Coaches that place an emphasis on weight or performance and an ideal feminine body, it's very common, unfortunately, still today, all over the country, D1, D2, D3, NAIA, it doesn't matter, high school. Coaches are subject to error, unfortunately, and this is why this information is so important for coaches to have, because being educated helps coaches identify successfully disordered eating in their athletes and prevent that in the future. It was found that these are the indicators that coaches use to identify disordered eating in their athletes to some degree of success. So now let's review. Some of the most common signs and symptoms and the most severe can be dry skin, brittle hair and nails, amenorrhea or menstrual dysfunction, delayed onset puberty, especially in young athletes, we're talking high school age, abdominal pain or frequent irregularity, athletes' anemia, bone mineral density loss, extreme or unpredictable fatigue, and extreme or sudden weight loss or weight gain. These are all some of the most common symptoms. While there are many more, and these vary extremely in severity, some of these are easy to identify based on the performance indicators that coaches use, as well as social cues. So athletes disappearing, athletes changing, so sudden change in or increase in anxiety or depression, resistance to external criticism, but extreme self-criticism, that can be a clear indicator. Resistance to follow or seek medical advice is a really important one, and that's something that Ali Ostrander was very clear about in her video. Hopefully you can identify some easy ways to spot these in athletes. So treatment. What does treatment look like for athletes? Why is it important for a coach or athletic trainer to know about treatment, or what can they do as treatment options? So a coach can't do a lot for treatment. And I am not going to talk specifically about the medical treatment. As soon as an athlete goes from a coaching setting to a medical setting, that is when the coach can only ask questions and no longer directly participate. If disordered eating is suspected in an athlete, an organization personnel with the best relationship with the athlete can initiate contact and start asking questions. If the suspicions are confirmed, then an athlete should be immediately referred to a supervising physician for evaluation to determine the severity of the situation and how the athlete can progress. It is definitely possible for an athlete to continue to compete and continue to train while in eating disorder recovery. Although, as I have discussed, eating disorder recovery can be difficult and can leave lasting side effects, which can make competing and training more difficult than your average athlete. And these are things that coaches can take into consideration when managing those athletes in the future. Regardless, an evaluation by a supervising physician is necessary when a coach discovers that an athlete is suffering from an eating disorder. And in addition to referring the athlete to a physician, they should also be referred to mental health professionals. Mental health professionals can make a significant impact in the recovery of eating disorders, but as far as coaches are concerned, identification and referral are really the only treatment options that coaches and athletic trainers have at their disposal. So next, we're going to talk about prevention. This will include team culture, awareness, and staff training. So prevention. Prevention can include knowledge and training for athletic training staff and coaches, knowledge and training for athletes and understanding what their role in weight and body metric, what role their weight and body metrics play in their performance, understanding that relationship beyond just the numbers, and getting rid of any preconceived notions that they need to be under a certain body fat percentage or that they have to be a certain weight in order to perform, because each individual's body is different. But understanding that relationship is really crucial for athletes, as well as their coaching staff. Mental health awareness and support as an entire team is also extremely vital. One of the reasons that athletes will hide eating disorders or be able to hide them for so long or develop disordered eating in the first place is because of social pressure and pressure from the team environment. So if a coach can create a supportive team environment with mental health awareness at the forefront, side by side with being a good student, being a good athlete, taking care of their nutritional needs, etc., taking care of their mental health needs is equally important in this process. Now we're going to talk about a study titled Mental Skills as Protective Attributes Against Eating Disorder Risks in Dancers. The aim of this study was to determine whether anxiety and depression, named negative affect in this study, mediates environmental pressure and eating disorder risk. Further, they wanted to determine whether there were athletic coping skills in the Athletic Coping Skills Index that can decrease the relationship between negative affect and eating disorder risk. In the study, data was collected from 205 female athletes from ages 17 to 25 who've been training an average of 12 and a half years. They were all polled according to environmental pressure, anxiety and depression, eating disorder risk, and mental skills. The majority of the participants were from the European American collegiate ballet dancers. However, there were collegiate, modern, and professional ballet dancers that were also included in the sample. Environmental pressure was recorded using the weight pressures in dance scale. And this is a questionnaire created to measure the pressures felt by dancers in relation to body size, weight, shape, etc. Depression and anxiety, or negative affect, was assessed using the Beck Depression Inventory, as well as the State and Trait Anxiety Inventory. Eating disorder risk was identified using an eating disorder inventory which is a 91-item questionnaire that assesses physiological, psychological, and behavioral traits common in anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Dancers that participated in this study completed a questionnaire that took between 1 and 2 hours, depending on the dancer. The results actually stated that the ACSI 28 had lower than expected reliability, and as such, they recommended for further research using this inventory. And analyses were conducted for weight pressure, negative effect, eating disorder risk, and eating disorder symptoms. A strong correlation between eating disorder risk and weight pressure, depression, and anxiety was found. There was a strong correlation found between eating disorder risk and weight pressure, depression, and anxiety, with a p-value less than 0.01. Both of the hypotheses in this study were confirmed, indicating that there is a significant link between negative effect and eating disorder risk. Next, we're going to go through our relevant research articles. In this research article, researchers aimed to determine the prevalence of disordered eating and pathogenic weight control behaviors in male collegiate athletes. All of these athletes completed an online questionnaire for the results. In this study, 732 athletes were polled online. 82% were classified as asymptomatic, 16% were symptomatic, and 1.1% were considered eating disordered. From there, the researchers decided to separate the athletes by sport, and that included a wide variety of sports, but were narrowed down to weight class sports, endurance sports, and ball sports. These were the three main categories of sport. After separating the athletes by sport type, there was a relationship found between sport type and disordered eating. 44% of weight class athletes experienced disordered eating or were in the symptomatic category. 12.8% of endurance athletes were classified as symptomatic, and 16% of ball sport athletes were classified as symptomatic. Some of the behaviors that they most closely monitored with the questionnaires were binge eating, exercise in order to burn calories specifically, and fasting or restricting diet. The results were consistent with their findings and with their hypotheses. This article serves as a testament to how close the relationship between high-level athletics and disordered eating really is. The next study that we're going to look at is actually a German study that included 1,022 German athletes that were all collected from endurance athletic events in and around Europe. All of these athletes responded to a questionnaire that included the Yale Food Addiction Scale and a questionnaire to diagnose exercise dependence in endurance sports. According to the results of this study, the prevalence of food addiction was 6.2%. Disordered eating showed up in 6.5% of polled athletes, and exercise dependency occurred in 30.5% of athletes that were polled. Further analyses determined that food addiction rises with BMI and exercise dependence score, and a close relationship was determined between all three of these aspects. The study concluded that a considerable number of amateur athletes suffer from food addiction, and the association between food addiction and exercise dependence is stronger than the relationship between eating disorders and exercise dependence, indicating that food addiction is a potentially more relevant subject for future research. This study was really unique and one of my favorites while doing research. The authors sought to challenge the fact that eating disorder recovery research typically included the absence of symptoms rather than the presence of adaptive aspects such as positive body image and healthy eating attitudes, including intuitive eating. Data was collected from 66 women with eating disorder history, and 31 controls were included. Of the participants, Those that were fully recovered from eating disorders did not differ at all from controls. And in fact, both groups, those that had recovered from an eating disorder and the controls, endorsed a much higher level of body appreciation where compared to the partially recovered and current eating disorder groups. The identical result was found for intuitive eating. This indicates that body appreciation and intuitive eating are things that can be used as preventative skills in order to reduce the likelihood of developing disordered eating, as in this study, none of the women that had those skills were either currently suffering from an eating disorder or were partially recovered from an eating disorder. The last article that we're going to take a look at is an article titled Disordered Eating and Exercise Dependence in Endurance Athletes. The next article that we're going to take a look at is titled Disordered Eating and Exercise Dependence in Endurance Athletes. This research took place in 2016, and it assesses the prevalence of disordered eating and exercise dependency among elite and amateur endurance athletes to find out whether there was a relationship between the two. In this study, 1,031 German athletes completed a set of questionnaires. These athletes were found very similarly to a previous article that I had mentioned, where these athletes were specifically endurance athletes that were collected from a variety of endurance sport competitions in and around Europe. This study used a set of questionnaires, including the exercise addiction inventory, in order to assess their athletes. The results found that 18.9% of athletes were at risk for developing disordered eating, which is slightly higher than the normal population. 2.7% were at risk for exercise dependency, and a significant correlation was found between the two. Of those 2.7 that were at risk for exercise dependency, nearly all of those athletes were also at risk for developing disordered eating. So in conclusion, I've talked about how prevalent eating disorders and disordered eating is in athletics in the United States and internationally, as well as some key signs and symptoms that are useful to identifying eating disorders for coaches and athletic training staff when looking at their own athletes, as well as psychological and social symptoms that can be observed and used to identify eating disorders in athletes, screening methods that can be used to do the same, and some risks and limitations of those screening methods that are extremely common and emphasize the importance of appropriate knowledge and education for coaching and training staff. And we went over several research articles highlighting the relationship between athletics and disordered eating, as well as exercise dependency, negative state or anxiety and depression, and its relationship with disordered eating, as well as some key skills, mental techniques that athletes can use to help prevent disordered eating in themselves and in their teammates, that include positive body image and body awareness, as well as intuitive eating. By this point, you should be able to identify several psychological, physical, and social signs and symptoms of disordered eating, identify one aspect of competition that influences an athlete to begin disordered eating, and explain at least one concept that can be taught to an athletic training or coaching staff in order to help prevent disordered eating in a team environment. Now let's discuss. What decisions do coaching and athletic training staff make that can impact the likelihood of disordered eating developing on their team or teams? What are some connections between disordered eating and high-level exercise, and why do you think these exist? What can athletes do to protect themselves from developing disordered eating, and what does a supportive environment look like with disordered eating prevention in mind? I hope you all have learned something today and that you can take this information and use it in your field in the ways that I suggested and the ways that you will discuss in these discussion questions. Thank you for your time. My name is Robin Butler, and this discussion was disordered eating in high-level athletes.